Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling something pretty fascinating, a question that's lingered for, wow, over 150 years.
hmm
Did William Shakespeare, the guy from Stratford-upon-Avon, actually write all those plays and poems?
Yeah, it sounds almost, well, sacrilegious to ask for most people, doesn't it? The answer seems obvious.
Totally. It's usually a definite yes, but there's this persistent debate kind of simmering under the surface.
And that's what we're diving into. Think of it less like we're trying to, overturn centuries of literary history right here, right now.
Not in the next half hour, anyway.
Exactly. It's more about unpacking this intellectual puzzle. It gets into how we even decide who wrote what counts as evidence. It's actually really interesting stuff.
So we've got a source that lays out this whole Shakespeare authorship question, right?
Yeah.
It covers the doubts, the arguments for other writers, and crucially, how mainstream scholars respond.
Yep. It covers the main angles, the reasons people started doubting, the evidence they point to for these alternative authors, and then the counter-arguments defending the traditional view.
Okay, so our mission today, pull out the key arguments, the main bits of evidence on both sides, give you a clear picture of what the fuss is all about without getting totally lost in the weeds. Because believe me, there are a lot of weeds.
There really are. It's a deep rabbit hole.
So where do we start? When did people actually begin questioning this? Was it always a thing?
No, not at all. What's really interesting is that the serious questioning only really got going in the mid-19th century.
Mid-1800s. But wasn't that like peak Shakespeare worship time?
Exactly. That's the irony. Shakespeare's reputation was massive, this towering genius figure. And it was precisely because he was held in such high esteem that some people started looking harder at his background.
Huh. So the pedestal actually invited scrutiny.
Kind of. The core issue, according to our source, was this feeling of a mismatch, a disconnect.
Between what and what?
Between the man, William Shakespeare of Stratford, his documented life, which seemed, fairly ordinary, humble origins, an obscure life in many ways.
Okay.
And then the works themselves, the incredible poetry, the genius, the sheer brilliance and sophistication. For some, that gap just seemed too big. How could that man write those plays?
Right. So the thinking became, maybe he didn't. Maybe the Stratford man was just a front.
That's precisely the idea that took hold for some. These doubters, often called anti-Stratfordians, started suggesting that Shakespeare of Stratford was essentially a cover, a frontman.
For who?
For someone else, someone maybe more educated, more aristocratic, someone who, for whatever reason, couldn't take public credit. Or maybe even a group of writers.
And why hide? What reasons do they suggest for this kind of literary conspiracy?
The source mentions a few common theories. Maybe the real author was too high up. The social ladder writing for the public theater wasn't seen as, proper for nobility back then.
Okay, social class. Makes sense.
Or maybe it involved state security, that the plays contained risky political commentary. Or another theory is that the author might have been a woman who obviously would have faced huge barriers to being recognized as a playwright in that era.
Interesting possibilities, but we should probably stress, what does mainstream scholarship say about all this?
Oh, absolutely. It's crucial to state that the vast majority of literary historians and Shakespeare scholars see this whole authorship question as a fringe theory.
So they don't really engage with it.
Well, they engage mostly to rebut the claims, to point out the flaws in the anti-Stratfordian arguments. It's not seen as a legitimate scholarly debate in the way, say, interpreting a specific line in Hamlet might be.
Gotcha. Okay, so let's dig into the anti-Stratfordian case itself. What kinds of arguments do they actually make? What's their strategy?
Generally, it's a two-pronged approach, as the source lays out. First, they try to dismantle the case for Shakespeare of Stratford, poke holes in his biography, highlight the gaps.
Discredit the traditional author.
Exactly. And second, they promote an alternative candidate, or sometimes candidates, and present evidence, often circumstantial, they believe points to that person. And yeah, usually there's an element of conspiracy involved to explain how the secret was kept.
Right, the cover-up angle. What specific qualities in the plays do they think the Stratford man couldn't possibly have possessed?
A big one is the sheer breadth of knowledge. They point to what they see as broad learning, deep familiarity with things like foreign languages, geography, classical literature, law, courtly manners, and Elizabethan and Jacobean politics.
Like insider knowledge.
Yeah. They argue the works show a level of education and worldly experience that seems way beyond what a Glover's son from a provincial town could have realistically acquired.
Okay, so that's the why, this perceived gap.
Okay.
Now let's look at the how. How do they use Shakespeare's actual biography against him?
They really focus on the type of documents we do have for him. You know, the mundane personal details.
Like what?
Birth, marriage, death records, tax documents, records of lawsuits he sued people for small debts, real estate deals, buying property.
So practical business-like stuff.
Exactly. They argue this paints a picture of a pragmatic businessman, maybe a theater entrepreneur, but not this, sensitive, intellectual, literary giant.
It's the show me the library card argument almost. Where's the proof he was a reader, a writer, an intellectual?
Precisely. They highlight the lack of evidence that he had a significant education. No university records, for instance, no records of him owning any books.
Which is maybe not that unusual for the time, but still.
Right. And crucially, no surviving personal letters or, and this is a big one, literary manuscripts definitively in his handwriting. We don't have his drafts of Hamlet, for example.
And his handwriting itself comes up, doesn't it? The signatures?
Yes, absolutely. The 6 signatures we have that are generally accepted as his are often brought up. Anti-Stratfordians tend to describe them as shaky, an illiterate scrawl, suggesting he was barely literate, let alone capable of writing the plays.
Okay, another piece they often mention is how his name was spelled, right? The hyphen.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. On some of the early quartos, the published versions of single plays, the name appears hyphenated. Shakespeare.
Like shaking a spear.
Kind of. And the argument is that this hyphenation, which wasn't consistent, suggests it was a made-up name, a pseudonym. They point out that sometimes fictional or allegorical names in plays were hyphenated like that.
So if not him, then who?
Well,
Who are the main contenders they put forward?
Well, the list has changed over the years, but the source highlights the most popular ones. Sir Francis Bacon was an early favorite, famous philosopher, scientist, courtier.
Right, very learned.
Very. Then there's Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford. He's probably the leading candidate today for many doubters. Also, Christopher Marlowe, the playwright who supposedly died young.
Oh yeah, the theory he faked his death and kept writing.
That's the one. And William Stanley, the 6th Earl of Derby, is another nobleman who gets mentioned.
Okay, so mostly well-educated, aristocratic figures, or another known writer. What kind of evidence do they use to link, say, Oxford or Bacon to the plays?
It's usually indirect or interpretive evidence. Our source groups it into a few types. They look for biographical parallels, similarities between events or people in the candidate's life and things in the plays.
Okay.
They find stylistic or thematic parallels between Shakespeare's works and known writings of their candidate.
Literary comparisons.
Right. And then there's the more esoteric stuff looking for hidden clues, hidden allusions, even cryptographic codes supposedly embedded in the text that reveal the true author.
Right, the Da Vinci Code kind of approach. And this isn't just some fringe internet thing, is it? Some pretty famous people have found these arguments convincing.
That's true, and the source makes a point of this. It mentions a small but highly visible group of supporters, including some really prominent names throughout history. Walt Whitman, Mark Twain, Helen Keller, Sigmund Freud. Even more recently, Supreme Court Justice John Paul Stevens, Prince Philip, Charlie Chaplin.
Wow, that's quite a list. It shows the arguments have some persuasive power, even if they don't convince the experts.
It definitely shows the enduring appeal of the mystery and the narrative, yeah.
Okay, so that's the case against Shakespeare, or at least the case for doubt. Now let's flip it. What's the case for William Shakespeare of Stratford? What do the mainstream scholars rely on?
Their foundation, as the source emphasizes, is direct documentary evidence. This is the standard stuff historians and literary scholars use to attribute authorship for any writer from that period. Consistency is key.
Okay, direct documentary evidence. What does that actually include for Shakespeare?
Well, first off, the title page attributions. Plays and poems published during his lifetime and shortly after his death had his name on them. William Shakespeare.
Seems pretty straightforward.
You'd think so. Then there are official records. Things like the Stationer's Register, which was like the copyright office of its day, listing him as the author when plays were entered for publication. And the accounts of the Revels Office, which recorded payments for court performances, also name him.
Government records, basically.
Yes. And then there's contemporary testimony. You have poets, historians, actors he worked with, other playwrights, people who knew him or knew of him, referring to him as the author.
People who were actually around at the time?
Exactly. And more recently, you have things like modern stylometric studies.
Ah, the computer analysis stuff.
Right? Using computers to analyze writing style, word frequencies, sentence structures, that kind of thing. These studies consistently point towards a single author whose linguistic fingerprint matches across the canon and is distinct from the proposed alternatives.
Okay. But what about the gaps the anti-Stratfordians talk about? The lack of letters, the missing library records?
Scholars absolutely acknowledge those gaps, but they attribute them to the generally low survival rate for documents from this period. It wasn't just Shakespeare. We lack that kind of detailed personal information for most people from the 16th and 17th centuries, including many other writers.
So it's not uniquely suspicious for him.
Not at all. They stress that the criteria used to say Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare are exactly the same criteria used for Ben Jonson, Christopher Marlowe before his death, Thomas Middleton, everyone else from that era. We apply the same standards.
That seems fair. And what about direct evidence for the other candidates, like Oxford or Bacon?
That's a crucial point the source makes. There is a striking lack of comparable direct evidence for any other candidate. No title pages saying by Edward de Vere, no contemporary records naming him as the author of these specific plays.
So the positive evidence points one way.
Pretty strongly, yes. And again, a huge point. Nobody seems to have questioned Shakespeare's authorship during his lifetime, or for like 200 years after he died. These doubts are a relatively modern phenomenon.
Right. Okay, let's circle back to some specific anti-Stratfordian claims and see how scholars respond. The idea that Stratford was a cultural desert.
Yeah, scholars push back on that. They agree it was a market town, not London, obviously. But they argue it wasn't some cultural backwater. His father was a town official, bailiff even, which is like the mayor. His mother came from local gentry. There was stuff going on.
And they also point out, don't they, that we don't have writing samples from the families of the other candidates either, or that Shakespeare's daughter's signature's looking shaky doesn't mean he was illiterate.
Exactly. It's applying a standard to Shakespeare they don't apply elsewhere, and they contrast the daughter's literacy, or lack thereof, with the numerous literate, intelligent female characters in the plays.
Good point. What about his education? The lack of university records.
The key here is the local grammar school, the King's New School in Stratford. It was free. And while we don't have student lists, those just haven't survived for that period. Schools like that provided a really intensive education. Latin grammar, classical literature like Ovid, who Shakespeare clearly knew, rhetoric, the standard Renaissance curriculum, and the teachers there were Oxford graduates. So the opportunity for a very solid classical education was right there.
So it's plausible he got a good education, even without university. And this signature is looking like a scrawl.
Scholars point out that the secretary hand he used was common then, especially among people writing quickly, like playwrights probably did. And the abbreviations, the breviagraphs, were standard practice too. It wasn't necessarily indicative of illiteracy at all.
Okay. What about the argument that there's no paperwork directly linking him to being a writer, as opposed to just a businessman or actor?
Mainstream scholars read those contemporary references differently. Things like Ben Jonson calling someone a poet ape. They see that as typical literary sparring and satire of the time, not some coded message about a frontman. It was a very competitive, sometimes bitchy literary scene.
Right. Writers taking shots at each other. Normal stuff.
Pretty much. They interpret these references within that literary context, not as evidence of a grand conspiracy.
And the circumstances around his death. Like, his will doesn't mention books or manuscripts. There wasn't a huge, immediate outpouring of grief.
Yeah, scholars address those too. Wills back then often focused on property and practical matters. Not mentioning literary papers wasn't unusual. The big memorial collection, the first folio, came out 7 years later, which was quite typical. Compiling and printing something like that took time and effort.
So the timing isn't suspicious in itself.
Not really. And phrases like our ever-living poet, used in dedications, were common ways to refer to great writers after their death their work lives on. As for his monument, while there are different early drawings, later evidence supports its current form, suggesting it wasn't radically altered to hide someone else.
It feels like for every piece of evidence the doubters raise, there's a pretty solid context-based explanation from the scholarly side.
That's generally the dynamic, yes. Yeah. The scholarly case rests heavily on historical context and standard practices of the time.
Okay, let's dive deeper into that positive historical evidence for Shakespeare. You mentioned contemporary references. How many are we talking about?
Our source says there are at least 23 documented instances during his lifetime where a William Shakespeare is referred to as a writer.
23, that's quite a few. Any standouts?
Definitely. A really key one is Francis Meres. In 1598, he published a book called Pilatus Tamia, Wit's Treasury.
So,
And in it, Mayers explicitly names Shakespeare among the best English playwrights for both comedy and tragedy. He even lists 12 specific plays like A Midsummer Night's Dream, Richard II, Romeo and Juliet. Some of these hadn't even been printed yet.
wow. So Mears knew his reputation as specific works well before they were all published.
Exactly. And Mayers also mentions Shakespeare's sugared sonnets that were apparently circulating among his private friends years before the sonnets were actually published in 1609. It's incredibly direct contemporary testimony linking the name to the works.
That does sound pretty hard to argue with. What else? You mentioned official records earlier.
Right. Remember his father got that coat of arms in 1596?
Yeah, making the family sort of minor gentry.
Exactly. This meant William could legally use the title gentleman. And we see this title attached to his name in official documents related to the plays.
Like where?
For example, the Stationer's Register entry for Much Ado About Nothing and Henry IV, Part 2, in 1600, lists the author as William Shakespeare. Another entry for King Lear calls him Master William Shakespeare. The Master or Mr. title specifically denotes his gentleman status.
So the official records are linking the author name to the man who had the social standing of a gentleman, the man from Stratford whose father got the coat of arms.
Precisely. It connects the writer to the specific individual. And it's not just official records. Other writers refer to him this way, too. John Davies of Hereford writes about Mr. Will Shakespeare. Thomas Freeman mentions Master W. Shakespeare. The historian John Stowe lists him among poets. They identify him as both a poet and a gentleman.
Okay, and after he died, did people still clearly know who they were talking about?
Absolutely. Look at the first folio, the collection of his plays published in 1623. Ben Jonson wrote that famous eulogy in it. To the memory of my beloved the author, Mr. William Shakespeare. Very clear title.
My beloved the author. Hard to misinterpret.
Right. And there were other poems praising him in the folio, too, by guys like Hugh Holland and Leonard Digges. They all identify Mr. William Shakespeare, the author, the man they knew.
It really seems like the people at the time had no confusion about who wrote the plays. Let's talk more about that recognition. The actors he worked with must be key witnesses.
Hugely important. John Heminges and Henry Condell, these guys were actors in Shakespeare's company, The King's Men, for like 20 years. They knew him well.
And they put the first folio together, right?
They did. And in their preface, addressed to the great variety of readers, they explicitly say they're doing it only to keep the memory of so worthy a friend and fellow Elio, as was our Shakespeare. Friend and fellow. They knew him personally as a colleague and the writer.
That personal testimony from longtime colleagues feels very powerful.
It really is. And then there's Ben Jonson again. We mentioned his eulogy, but he knew Shakespeare personally, too. Shakespeare actually acted in one of Jonson's early plays, Every Man in His Humor.
Oh, interesting. So they definitely knew each other.
For sure. And Jonson, he was brilliant, but also famously critical, sometimes quite prickly. He did have some criticisms of Shakespeare thought he sometimes lacked polish. Wrote too fast, maybe.
Modest criticism.
Yeah, but even with those criticisms, in his private notes, published later as Timber or Discoveries, Jonson wrote, and this is really telling, I loved the man and do honor his memory, on this side idolatry, as much as any. He was indeed honest and of an open and free nature. It shows real personal affection and respect alongside the critical perspective.
That nuance makes it even more believable somehow. What about other playwrights? His competitors?
We see acknowledgments there, too. There were these plays, the Parnassus plays, performed by students at Cambridge around the turn of the century. They mentioned Shakespeare, kind of making fun of him for being successful without having a university education like them.
Academic snobbery.
Totally. But even while being snarky, they acknowledge him as a popular actor and playwright. Thomas Heywood, another playwright, got really annoyed when some of his own poems were wrongly included in an edition attributed to Shakespeare. He protested publicly, clearly distinguishing his work from the famous Shakespeare's. Later, he affectionately calls him mellifluous Shakespeare, even using the familiar will.
So even rivals recognized his authorship.
It seems so. John Webster, another major playwright, dedicated his play The White Devil by praising several contemporaries, including M. Shakespeare, listing him alongside respected figures like Chapman and Johnson.
And wasn't there something about his natural talent being recognized?
Yes. Francis Beaumont, another playwright, wrote a poem to Ben Jonson where he contrasts Johnson's learned, laborious writing process with Shakespeare's seemingly effortless natural genius, suggesting Shakespeare could whip up scenes easily while Jonson was still sweating over his lines. Again, it acknowledges Shakespeare the writer and his particular reputation for innate talent.
Okay, shifting back to his death and legacy. The monument in Stratford Church. What does that tell us?
Well, it was put up sometime before 1623, so fairly soon after his death. The inscription is quite grand, comparing him to figures like Nestor, Socrates, and Virgil, figures known for wisdom, intellect, and art. It clearly identifies the man buried there as a writer of great stature. And this specific monument is mentioned in the First Folio and other contemporary writings.
Connecting the physical gravesite to the literary reputation. What about his will again? You mentioned he left things to his actor friends.
Yes, specifically, his will includes bequests to my fellows John Hemming, Richard Burbage, and Henry Cundall. These weren't just random friends. They were his business partners and fellow actors in The King's Men. Burbage was the company's leading tragedian, likely the first Hamlet, Othello, Lear. And Hemingway and Cundall, as we said, compiled the folio.
So the will reinforces those professional and personal ties to the theater world and the very people who preserved his plays.
Exactly. It all weaves together. John Taylor, the water poet, mentioned Shakespeare's death in print quite early on. And Ben Jonson, in the folio, doesn't just praise the author, he praises the portrait engraving in the folio, urging the reader to look not on his picture, but his book. And he calls Shakespeare the sweet swan of Avon, directly linking the great writer to Stratford-upon-Avon.
Avon, the river that runs through Stratford. Hard to miss that connection.
Pretty direct. And Leonard Digges, another poet who contributed verses to the folio, specifically mentions the Stratford monument in his poem. Interestingly, Digges' stepfather had connections to Shakespeare through property dealings mentioned in Shakespeare's will. Small world.
Wow. It all seems very interconnected around Stratford and the London theater scene.
There's even an elegy by a poet named William Bass, written shortly after Shakespeare's death, wishing Shakespeare had been buried in Westminster Abbey alongside Chaucer and Spenser, but acknowledging he's buried in Stratford. Again, linking the famous poet to that specific place.
Okay, so the historical paper trail seems pretty consistent. What about evidence from inside the works themselves? Do the plays tell us anything about the author?
Well, interestingly, yes, but maybe not in the way the anti-Stratfordians think. Our source points out that some contemporaries actually noted Shakespeare's lack of deep classical learning compared to university-trained writers like Jonson.
So people at the time noticed he wasn't like a classic scholar.
Sort of, and this actually fits with certain, well, mistakes or classical blunders in the plays. Things like mispronouncing classical names, or getting historical details slightly wrong, or citing Plato centuries before Plato lived.
Errors that a deeply learned scholar might not make.
Possibly. It suggests someone whose classical knowledge might have come more from readily available sources, like translations or summaries, rather than reading everything in the original Latin Greek.
Like using the Classics Illustrated version.
Maybe the Renaissance equivalent. Scholars have suggested he heavily used a popular reference book, Thomas Cooper's Thesaurus, for mythology and history because some of the errors in the plays actually mirror errors in that specific book.
Oh, that's fascinating. So his mistakes actually fit the profile of someone educated at a good grammar school using reference books rather than a university scholar.
That's the argument. And later critics, like Samuel Johnson in the 18th century, praised Shakespeare not for his erudition, but for his incredible observation of life, his understanding of human nature, his characterization. That was seen as his genius.
What about the huge vocabulary argument? Anti-Stratfordians always bring that up.
Yeah, the idea that he had this uniquely massive vocabulary. Modern computer analysis has kind of put that in perspective. Yes, he used a lot of words, but considering he wrote so much plays, poems, different genres, his vocabulary size isn't wildly out of line with other prolific writers of the time when you account for the size of the surviving work.
So impressive, but maybe not supernaturally so.
Right. And his style is different from the university wits, those university-educated playwrights like Marlowe or Greene. Shakespeare's plays tend to wear their learning a bit more lightly, less overt showing off of Latin phrases, perhaps.
Does he reference the kind of education he likely did have? The grammar school stuff?
Yes. There are references to things like Lilly's Latin Grammar, which was the standard textbook used in schools like the one in Stratford, allusions to teaching methods used in petty schools, things consistent with that kind of background.
And the stylometry. The computer analysis you mentioned, what does that show again?
The studies, like those from the Claremont Shakespeare Clinic, use algorithms to measure quantifiable features of writing style, preferred words, sentence length patterns, use of function words like an or the.
A linguistic fingerprint?
Essentially, yes. And these studies overwhelmingly find a consistent authorial signal across the main body of Shakespeare's work. Crucially, they also find that this signal is distinctly different from the signals of candidates like Bacon, Marlowe, or Oxford. The styles don't match.
So the data supports one author, and that author isn't stylistically like the main alternative candidates.
That's the strong conclusion from those studies. They also show his style evolving over time, which you'd expect, matching shifts in theatrical tastes from the Elizabethan to the Jacobean era, and even adapting to the different demands of playing spaces like the indoor Blackfriars Theatre versus the outdoor Globe.
Does the content match the timeline too?
Yes, the thematic concerns of the plays often correlate well with the political and social contexts of the accepted dates of composition, supporting the traditional chronology. And when you look closely at the texts of plays he co-wrote late in his career, like Henry VIII or The Two Noble Kinsmen, the textual evidence suggests he and his collaborator were writing scenes concurrently, passing the work back and forth, not one writer finishing up drafts left by someone who died years earlier, like Oxford or Marlowe.
That seems like very specific textual evidence against some of the alternative theories.
It is quite specific, yeah. It points towards collaboration between living writers.
Okay, this has been incredibly detailed. Let's just briefly touch on the history of the authorship question itself. How did it evolve after that mid-19th century start?
Well, as we said, it grew partly out of that intense bardolatry. People almost couldn't believe someone so great could come from such a, quote, humble background.
So snobbery played a role.
Arguably, yes, for some. Early on, as mentioned, Delia Bacon and William Henry Smith championed Francis Bacon. There was even a whole cipher craze for a while, people trying to find secret messages supporting Bacon hidden in the texts.
Okay.
When the Bacon theory started to look less plausible under scrutiny, people started looking for other candidates, especially aristocratic ones. Marlowe, Rutland, Derby had brief moments. Then in 1920, J. Thomas Looney published Shakespeare Identified.
Looney, seriously?
Yep, J. Thomas Looney. And his book powerfully argued for Edward de Vere, the Earl of Oxford. Oxford has been a leading contender, maybe the leading contender for anti-Stratfordians ever since.
Why Oxford? What was the appeal?
Looney argued Oxford's life experiences, his travels, his education, his status as a courtier and known poet, though his acknowledged poetry is quite different stylistically, fit the supposed profile of the author better than Shakespeare's.
Gotcha. And it didn't stop there. Were there other theories?
Oh, yeah. Group theories popped up the idea that a committee wrote the plays. Oxfordism itself kind of faded a bit, then had revivals. There was even the bizarre Prince Tudor theory, suggesting Oxford had an affair with Queen Elizabeth I, and their secret son was the real author or something.
Wow. Okay, getting wilder.
It can get pretty conspiratorial. In the later 20th century, Charlton Ogburn Jr. became a major popularizer of the Oxford theory, using media appearances, books, even organizing those moot court trials where lawyers argued the case.
Trying to prove it legally, almost.
Sort of. And then the internet obviously gave the whole debate a huge new platform. You see endless websites, forums, that Wikipedia page being constantly edited.
Right. And there's that survey of professors.
Yeah, a 2007 survey found, I think, something like 80–90% of Shakespeare professors saw no reason to question the traditional attribution. A very small minority expressed doubts. James Shapiro, a prominent scholar, wrote a book analyzing the sociology of the authorship question, why people want to believe it wasn't Shakespeare.
And fictional takes keep popping up, like the movie Anonymous.
Exactly, which portrayed the Oxfordian theory, bringing it to a massive audience, even though it played very fast and loose with historical facts. It shows the story itself has legs.
Absolutely.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so we've covered a ton of ground here. As we wrap up this deep dive, what are the absolute core takeaways? What's the bottom line on the Shakespeare authorship question?
I think the fundamental thing, as the source lays out, is this clash over what counts as evidence. You have the mainstream scholars relying on the direct contemporary documentary evidence, the title pages, the records, the testimony from people at the time, which all points consistently to William Shakespeare of Stratford.
The standard historical method.
Right. And on the other side, you have the anti-Stratfordians who find that evidence insufficient or unconvincing. They prioritize circumstantial arguments, perceived biographical inconsistencies, interpretations of the works themselves, and often a narrative involving hidden identities and conspiracy.
And the academic world sides overwhelmingly with
the documentary evidence. Despite the efforts and occasional high-profile supporters of the alternative theories, the scholarly consensus remains firmly behind Shakespeare of Stratford-upon-Avon.
So for everyone listening, hopefully this journey through the arguments gives you a sense of just how complex these questions of historical and literary attribution can be.
Yeah, it really shows the different ways people weigh evidence, interpret gaps, and build narratives, and how a compelling story, even one challenging established facts, can endure for centuries.